Okay, I'm a little pressed for time to get this done. So I'm about to read an email from, it's a really good, it's a couple of secondhand stories and they're really good. And this writer has sent another email with a PDF attached with another story. I may or may not get to that. I'm not planning this out really well. I'm just trying to crank out a video because I'm off this week and I want to get as many out as I can, maybe one a day. Wouldn't that be, I would love to do that. So let's get going here. He wants to be anonymous and he writes, I live in Colorado. I moved here in late 2010 and in the spring of 2012, I packed up and headed north on a road trip through several states. These states included Colorado, Idaho, California, Utah, Oregon, Washington, and Montana. Prior to my departure, I'd come across a book that included a photograph taken in 1992 by some hikers. They apparently heard something or someone with very heavy footfalls coming down the trail above them. When it came into view, they snapped a photo of it. The reason I mention this is that their encounter took place not far from Mike's ranch. Mike's ranch, he's talking about a big game hunter that I interviewed several months back. I don't even know where Mike's ranch is. I think he gave the name of the town, but I've also heard that some people have found his place and they're really bugging the crap out of him. So y'all don't go look Mike up. He's a real private guy. He's having a lot of issues with this Bigfoot thing, but I digress. So that's who he's talking about with Mike. My trip included a visit with the author of that book. Upon my return, and for reasons unknown to me, many of the locals began sharing their Bigfoot sightings and their encounters with me. In fact, these stories came from more than a dozen people, all having experiences here in the surrounding mountains. A couple of these I want to share with you. One evening, I visited a local restaurant for dinner. The hostess was a friend, and new people had been sharing their Bigfoot stories with me. She got my attention and introduced me to a woman who had a story that I might like to hear. And her story went like this. A man pulled his travel trailer up to one of the area lakes for a few days of camping and fishing. During his first night, it was raining, which kept him inside. As he lay in bed trying to go to sleep, sudden screams and howls broke out from the surrounding hills. He had no idea what was making the noises, and they persisted to keep him awake. Frustrated, he got up and went outside to fire off a few rounds from his gun. He returned to his bunk, and just as he was about to doze off, something began violently rocking and shaking the camper from side to side. He finally passed out from fear and exhaustion. And when he awoke, the sun was up and the rain had stopped. So too had the harassment. He cautiously exited the camper and walked around his rig looking for damage. There was no damage, but he did see some large 17-inch footprints in the wet soil all around his trailer. So it wasn't a dream. It really did happen, and that terrified him. He packed up and he hauled his butt back down the mountain. I would too. I don't know how this woman learned of his encounter, but I suspect the man lived in the area because not too many outsiders know how to get there. He may have shared his experience with someone she knew. After she told me the story, I asked when it took place, and she told me that it happened just a couple of weeks earlier. Well, that was interesting to me because I was just up at that lake maybe the same day or the day before this man arrived. A friend and I had visited the lake for some drone photography. As we got out of the car and started looking for a good place to launch the drone, I got the distinct feeling they were in the area. From the sound of the man's story, apparently they were. The next story comes from a location to the south of the first story. One day I was talking with a restaurant owner about some of the Bigfoot stories people had shared with me. One of those stories was about a woman who lived near the Colorado-New Mexico border and how she often catches them looking in the windows of her house, and they frequently leave tracks all over her property. One time when her visiting sister was returning to the house from her car, she noticed a large brown-haired Sasquatch walking up the mountain behind the house. As you can imagine, the restaurant owner didn't believe a word that I was saying. It would turn out, however, the following morning, a customer came in and sat down for breakfast. She greeted him and asked where he was from. His answer was the exact same town from the story that I told her the day before. "Really?" she asked. "Have you ever seen a Bigfoot?" The man turned completely pale and he said, "Well, yes, that's why I'm here right now." He continued, "A couple of days ago, myself and some other men were cutting fuel wood in a permit area. Out of nowhere, a large rock landed between myself and some other men. I looked at the rock and then up at the men. They were frozen with fear and staring at the tree line behind me. I turned to see what they were looking at, and there, standing in the open about 40 yards away, was a large Sasquatch 7 to 8 feet tall. We all dropped our gear and raced down the mountain in our trucks." He added that all their equipment was still up there and that he was trying to figure out how to retrieve it over breakfast because none of the other men wanted to go back with him. I have several other stories that I may share someday, but these are the ones that people have shared with me who had experiences in Colorado away from my area. The remaining stories took place here where I live, as well as in some other states, but they're different sort of encounters than the rock throwing and camper shaking stories mentioned here. I'll save those for another time. And that's the end of his email. And I actually fired off an email to this man today because if he's got a lot of, I love secondhand stories. That's what I tell y'all a lot of times when I write my own story. They're secondhand stories that I've heard through my life. I write them down and build them into a story. And I love hearing a story in that kind of format because sometimes the hearer, the person who hears the story, kind of gathers some unique information that maybe the teller didn't realize, and they're able to turn around and tell another man's story in a much more clear way. Sometimes, not always. But I fired an email off to this man and I asked him if he'd like to come on for an interview and tell us all these stories. So I hope I hear back from him soon. But anyway, all that said, thanks for this email. It was really good. I appreciate it. Okay, I just opened his PDF and it's another good story. He's taken someone else's story and written a story around it, added dialogue and stuff, and it should be great. So I'm going to jump right into this story from this anonymous emailer. He says, "Hey, DC, I have a story that I'd like to share with you and your audience if you feel like they would like it. Cheers." Now, let me say, I haven't even read this. I'm reading this just cold right now, so I don't even know what happens in this story. It's got a lot of dialogue, and it's really good, or it seems like it's really good, so let's get into it. One evening, my friend Tammy and her family were quietly at home preparing for bed when her and her husband Jim heard a ruckus coming from the garbage dumpster down the hill at the end of their driveway. It's one of those big brown dumpsters that belongs to the county, and it's where they and their two neighbors place their garbage for pickup every 2 weeks. The ruckus coming from the dumpster sounded like a bear was trying to get inside for a late-night snack. Tammy looked over at Jim and asked if he'd locked the dumpster lids after taking the garbage out earlier that day. This is common practice when you live in the mountains during the spring and summer months. Jim said that he had, so they both shrugged their shoulders and figured the bear would move on to another dumpster when it couldn't get inside theirs. This has happened many times before whenever they forget to lock the lids or before they hear the bears are out of hibernation. However, they soon heard more loud thumps and bangs. Then there was the unmistakable slow screech from the rusty hinges. The bear just managed to open the lock and lifted the lid to get inside. "Crap!" yelled Tammy as they both jumped to their feet. Jim reached for a flashlight while Tammy switched the front porch light on before they both stepped outside onto the porch. Using the beam from the flashlight, they could see the large hungry bear with black fur digging around in the dumpster. "So you locked the dumpster, huh?" she said. Jim huffed and just looked back at her. "Yes, I did," while rolling his eyes. Bang! That was the second lip falling backwards against the top of the dumpster. When they returned their gaze upon the bear, they could tell it was still digging around inside the container, but something wasn't right. The bear didn't jump inside or climb up on top of the bin like they usually do. "What is that laying on the ground next to the dumpster?" Tammy asked. Jim squinted his eyes a bit to better his focus in the low light. "It looks like a couple of trash bags. Those look like the trash bags I took out earlier today," he concluded. They looked at each other with a puzzled look on their faces as the bear appeared to be shuffling the trash around. Jim didn't want to clean up the expected mess, so he yelled at the bear to go away. Hey bear, go!" And the ruckus stopped, and the bear lowered the lid and stood up straight, looking back at them. "Oh my God," said Tammy, "that's a Bigfoot." They've heard about several sightings before, but those happened 10 or 15 miles away. This was too close, and it shocked them. They didn't know the Sasquatches came around people's home like this. As the 8 to 9 foot tall Sasquatch stared back at them, all Jim could say was, "Sorry to you, brother. We'll go back inside now and let you continue your business." Jim turned and looked at Tammy, and then motioned for her to come inside with him. Once back in the living room, Tammy reached back for the light switch out of habit, and then as she was about to turn the porch light off, she thought it best to leave it on to give their unusual neighbor some light in case they needed it. Jim and Tammy stayed up talking about their incidents for 30 more minutes before turning in. The kids were still in their bedrooms and didn't hear any of what had just transpired. Their bedrooms were on the back side of the house, so they didn't see the porch light come on or the visiting Sasquatch. Tammy and Jim agreed not to say anything to the children, but would tell them not to stay out after dark, just to be safe. In the morning, Tammy was the first to get up, and after turning on the coffee maker, put on her slippers and quietly walked outside to the end of their driveway. The previous night's events were weighing heavy on her mind. As she made her way closer and closer to the dumpster, she noticed the garbage bags were nowhere in sight. She was sure that they would have a mess to clean up with the ravens and other critters looking for a morning feast. Where are the bags? Did the Sasquatch take them with him, she wondered? She reached the end of the driveway and turned to the left to approach the two-lid dumpster. "Oh my God," she said softly to herself. Standing motionless about 6 feet from the dumpster, Tammy stared at the locks and tried to make sense of what she was looking at. "The locks are secured in place on both lids," she mumbled aloud. By this time, Jim had seen her from inside the living room and went out to join her. She had not heard him approaching, but his presence next to her jarred her out of deep thought. Was the whole thing just a dream of some sort, she asked? Unsure what she meant, he asked what she was talking about. Tammy lifted her right arm and pointed at the locked lids before looking back at him. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "See, I told you I locked the dumpster lids." Jim let out a chuckle and walked over to the dumpster to unlock and open the lids. "I wonder what it was looking for," Tammy said. "If it was a bear, it was looking for food, but it wasn't a bear. So was it also looking for food?" Looking inside the dumpster, Jim said, "Everything looks normal. No bags are torn apart, and the 2 kitchen bags I put in here yesterday are right where I put them." What do you mean, Jim? That Sasquatch put them back inside the dumpster and then locked the lids and he left? She was confused. Would a Bigfoot really do that? Jim didn't answer. He didn't know the answer, but he was curious. What was the Bigfoot looking for if not for food scraps? Well, I don't know, she said. Maybe the neighbors saw the bags beside the dumpster this morning and put them inside so the birds wouldn't get at them and make a mess. It sounded logical, but then Jim noticed something. Wait a minute, he said, as he pulled the garbage bags out one by one and placed them on the ground. He continued to remove everything until he could see the bottom of the bin. Something was missing. Tammy, come look at this, he said as he motioned to her while pointing inside the dumpster. She looked inside and didn't see anything unusual, but then it clicked. The broken rocking horse is missing, she exclaimed. Do you think the Bigfoot took it, or maybe one of the neighbors saw it and took it? I don't know. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, Jim wondered. And then he continued, but if they didn't and the Sasquatch took it, do you think it knew it was here and came for it once it got late and we were getting ready for bed? That was a loaded question, and he knew it. Tammy replied, that would mean that it's watching us, right? But from where? And what would that huge Bigfoot want with a toddler's broken rocking horse? And then it made sense. Whether or not it knew the rocking horse was there didn't really matter. They could simply ask the neighbors if they pulled it from the garbage. While they discussed the matter, their two kids had gotten out of bed and noticed the house was empty. Looking around for their parents, they spotted them outside at the road. They both put on shoes and walked out to join their parents. Billy, their 12-year-old son, asked, what's going on and why is the trash piled up in the yard? Jim and Tammy just looked at each other. They weren't prepared to discuss what happened the night before, and they still didn't know what to say. After all, what were they doing at the dumpster with a big pile of garbage laying at their feet? And what would the neighbors think? Tammy looked at her husband and she said, just tell them they're old enough. Old enough for what? Their daughter Sarah chimed in. Last night after you two went to bed, we had a visitor. He or it was going through our garbage but didn't make a mess or dig through the garbage bags. Their dad continued, your mother and I thought it was just another bear, but it managed to unlock the lids, and when we yelled at it, it stood up and it looked at us, and it wasn't a bear. What was it? Billy asked. Well, it looked like a Bigfoot, his dad continued. We left it alone and we went to bed. This morning, your mother and I came out to see what it may have been looking for or for what it had taken. Their mother added, we both agree that for the time being, we want both of you to be inside the house by the time it gets dark. No playing outside after dark until we know more, okay? Okay, Billy and Sarah said at the same time. The day went on as normal. The kids played with friends for most of the afternoon before returning home for dinner. When Jim returned from work, they all sat at the dinner table and they ate quietly. Dad, Billy asked. Yes, son. I was thinking about what you said this morning. Did you find out what the Bigfoot took or what it was looking for? No, your mother and I thought it was the food, but it didn't open any of the bags or take the garbage. At least not that we can tell. We did notice your sister's old rocking horse was missing, though. Sarah sat up straight. What? I'd thrown the rocking horse away, her dad said, because the leg was broken and you're 8 now and you don't play with it anymore. Sarah looked at her mom with a pouting expression, as if waiting for her mom to say something. But it was Billy who spoke next. Why would a Bigfoot take a human toy? Your mother and I think that it may have children of its own, or maybe the neighbors or someone else took it with plans to repair it. We don't know. Bigfoot children? Billy repeated out loud, looking at his little sister. Do you think they like toys like we do? Sarah added, do you think their children play at human playgrounds? Tammy jumped in and added that it could be possible, but there's really no telling. Besides, she said, we really don't know if the Bigfoot took your rocking horse. Until we do, just keep your eyes open when you guys play outside or are with your friends. We still want you two in by dark and no going out after dinner. Life returned to normal with no more visible bear or Sasquatch activity. That is, until we had our first good snow. It was early November and the temperatures dropped enough to allow for about a foot of fresh snow. The following afternoon, Billy came running home, wet from the snow, all out of breath and barely able to talk. He said that he was out in the canyon checking on his trap lines after the snow stopped when something strange happened. While walking across the meadow to locate the first game trail in the trees on the opposite side, small branches and sticks started landing in the snow in front of him. He stopped and he looked to see who it was, but nobody was out there with him. In fact, his footprints in the snow were the only tracks that he could see. When I started walking towards the woods, the sticks appeared to land in the snow again and again, but nobody was there, Mom. I swear it's the truth. Maybe it was the wind, Sarah said with a smirk. But there's more, Billy continued. I started running to the trees and then I stopped after I entered the woods. The flying branches had stopped, so I just stood there looking around and listening. Listening for what? His young sister said. I wanted to see if someone was out there with me, and then I heard them. Them? His mother asked with one raised brow. Yes, I'm telling you guys the truth, and I'm not kidding. I heard kids giggling. What would kids be doing way out there in the woods after a snow? Tammy asked. I don't know, but I know what I heard. And then Billy quietly asked his mom, do you think it could have been the Bigfoot children? What? Let's stop talking about this and just wait until your father gets home from work. We'll talk more about it then. Billy said okay as he turned and went to his room. He glanced over at his sister and she just shook her head. Both kids were in their rooms when Jim got home from work. Tammy pulled him aside before he went any further to tell him what had happened to Billy. What should we do? Tammy asked. Let me get cleaned up and we can talk afterwards. I really need a hot shower right now. Tammy went back into the kitchen and started warming up dinner. She called the kids to help set the table and get cleaned up. She stopped Billy and told him his father was taking a shower and that he could talk about his encounter during dinner, but only if his father asked him about it. Your father's had a long day and he wants to unwind, so you should be respectful of your father's wishes. Okay, Mom, Billy said as he continued setting plates on the table. That evening, the dinner table discussion turned out to be more interesting than anyone could have expected. After Billy shared what happened with his father, Jim sat there quiet and didn't say anything for several minutes. The kids just looked at him and then over at their mom. Billy remembered to respect his dad and that he had had a long day. Everyone just waited for him to look up from his plate and to say something. Tammy reached over and touched Jim's arm, asking, "Is everything okay?" He looked up and then at her. He then looked at the kids across the table from him. "What's wrong, Dad?" asked Sarah. He smiled and said, "Everything's fine, honey. Daddy just had a long day." Billy spoke up and asked what he thought of his experience in the meadow earlier and who he thought might have been throwing those branches. Jim turned to look at Tammy and he gave a sigh. "I have something to tell all of you, but I don't know how to begin. I suppose that I should start with Billy and what happened this afternoon, but I think I'll start with what happened to me this morning." "What happened, Dad?" Billy said. "This morning on my way to work, it was still dark out and I had my brights on going through the canyon. Before the turnoff, I noticed something large standing on the side of the road and just at the edge of my lights. As I slowed for the turn, it stepped out into the road so that I could see it." "What was it, Dad?" Sarah interrupted. "It stood on two legs like the Bigfoot that had visited us last summer, but it was reddish-brown in color, not black like the one that picked through our garbage, and it was also a female." Jim looked back at Tammy with a blank gaze and paused to take a few deep breaths and collect his thoughts. "Honey, when I came home and you told me what happened to Billy, my mind started spinning. In the shower, I hoped the stream and the hot water would help clear my mind, but it didn't." "What do you mean, Jim?" she said. After a long pause and a drink from his glass of water, he continued. "The Sasquatch walking out in the road ahead of me wasn't the only strange thing that happened this morning. I don't understand what's happening or why, Maybe there's some logical explanation, but I just don't know what it is. Jim slowly continued. After the morning shift changed, the night crew packed up and went home. I was all alone in the office. One of the guys left an unopened can of Dr. Pepper out on the counter, and I decided to put it outside on the cement post near the door. I figured it would be cold in about 30 minutes or so. After my morning checks, I opened the door and reached for the soda, but it was gone. I walked around in the dark, in the cold, looking for the can of pop, but I couldn't find it. As I scratched my head and turned to go back inside, I thought I heard giggling like that of children. And that's the end of the story. That's a great story. It's a really good story, and he put it together great. The way he writes his emails to me, I don't think this is a fictional story. I think it's a secondhand story that he's written around it. But again, I haven't talked to him. Maybe we can get him on for an interview. But it was a great set of stories, and it made a whole video, and I really enjoyed putting it together. I don't really like reading these cold like this because I don't know how they're going to end. But and this one kind of caught me by surprise, but it was still really good. Great story, man. Great story. Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.